Hi, we're Basal. I'm Rosa.
I'm Pospey.
And before we begin, we'd like to frame our ask today by saying that this is our first rack. So we're at a kind of friends and family round or pre-seed round in terms of the scope of the resources that we're requesting. We're pitching the concept in order to become a legitimate spoke and be able to bring on a design lead / co-founder. We plan to spend the first 3 months building a UI demo. We've organised with labs to then do a check-in before proceeding further.
So this project is the result of roughly 2 years of thinking that I've been doing on the question of how do we create a truly ethical and sustainable global economy. And since Rose has come on board, we've narrowed in on this vision of democratising the product certification industry. And we feel that this is the answer to that question.
So what's the problem? We've identified that the certification industry is ripe for disruption because it's analog and opaque. Firstly, people don't trust institutions. I think we're all aware of that. The underlying evidence and assumptions behind them are not transparent. For example, organic has varying definitions, especially regarding the treatment of livestock and the use of pesticides on nearby farms. Another example is free range, which as a definition is continually changed in Australia. And chickens are not even classed as animals in the USA. Thirdly, there are lots of hidden interests behind certifications, and they're routinely bought rather than earned. For example, the heart tick, a well-known Australian certification, was infamously paid for by McDonald's. They paid $300,000 a year to certify a fillet of fish and chicken McNuggets as heart tick approved.
And a little closer for us, the World Wildlife Foundation was also involved in a scandal a few years back in Australia, where they had endorsed some salmon fisheries in Tasmania as being sustainably farmed. And later an internal memo was leaked, basically saying that this wasn't true at all. So things are actually more nuanced than just the certifier being bad. There are misaligned interests internally within different departments in NGOs.
Operating in a socially responsible manner is becoming a requirement for business worldwide. Investors want to fund companies that consider environmental social governance and corporate social responsibility, otherwise known as ESG and CSR. However, the same lack of good quality, reliable certification data also affects the investment industry. ESG and CSR standards exist, but as yet none are certifiable. Thomas Hempel, a professor at the University of Michigan Business School, states that the ISO 26000 CSR standard is handicapped by being too broad in scope to be useful in the context of specific industries and sectors, and too costly and time-consuming for many small and medium-sized enterprises to implement. The real drive behind this trend in investment is consumer demand. We did some research and validation and found that the vast majority of consumers want to make more ethical purchasing decisions, but many feel they lack reliable information to help them do so. There are already companies and apps attempting to fill this gap. In our market research, we've uncovered that the common issue the majority face is subjectivity. This means that the information they provide doesn't align with people's own ideas of what ethical means, hence the negative ratings. In addition to subjectivity, there's also a coarseness problem. For example, what does environment actually mean? There's a lot more competitor analysis in our appendix, but in brief, in the bottom left quadrant, there are transparency platforms tailored for enterprises, and they're very focused on increasing transparency and reducing cost. Really, they're about attempting to show the truth of what is produced. But whose truth is it? Enterprises are not necessarily very objective in terms of testing the veracity of the data provided. And they also make their own choices about what to disclose and what to keep private. On the upper left-hand quadrant, we have platforms that are focused on sustainability metrics. They aim to promote ethical business practices, but again, they're very much targeted at enterprises. On the bottom right, we have some of the very few consumer-focused blockchain apps, which are about incentivizing consumers to act more ethically. And then on the top right, there's Boycott, which is a non-blockchain app, but it's worth a mention as it's one of the few ethical consumption apps that avoids the subjectivity trap by running on user-curated campaigns. However, the assumptions made in campaign creation are still opaque. We're taking this to a whole new level because we're bringing blockchain to the table to make assumptions and underlying evidence transparent. By doing this, we hope to create much more targeted signals that direct action towards more ethical production practices.
And so how do we solve these problems? What are we going to do here? So to begin with, there's sort of this base set of logic that kind of naturally flows. So in order to create an ethical, sustainable future at a global scale, we're going to first need access to the complete production data set and universal access to that data set so that everyone's equally empowered to act upon it. In other words, we can't really do anything about ethics until we can see what's going on. And blockchain, of course, is the place to find this data. If we skip to the next slide, there's a lot of businesses in this industry already all working on this problem. And so this is a solved issue, and we can just import this data and aggregate it on the back of work that's already being done. Secondly, we need assurance that this data is actually valid and truthful. And so we need third-party verification and verify reputation systems, such as those offered by the IXO Foundation or Alice. As Rosa said, we need more veracity in terms of the data provided. It's just as easy to greenwash on the blockchain. And we can't just leave it up to enterprises or even NGOs to report honestly. And then thirdly, once we have all these things, we need mechanisms to actually act on that data in a more informed manner. And that's where we come in. And to do this, we want to create certifications which are accountable, transparent, and informed. And this is really the key part. The whole point of our foundational design, our data model, system architecture, etc., is to avoid imposing our own ethics and logic on this process. And back to these guys, there's sort of a natural go-to-market progression here. Some of these platforms like Devery are entirely open source. Others are on the Ethereum mainnet, so there's access to that data just provided for free. Others like Viant, VeChain, Everledger, AgriDigital are kind of invite-only and sitting in corporate silos. And others have self-sovereign data ownership models like Origin Trail. So essentially, we can use the open ones to pressure the more closed ones to release more data progressively. And by integrating with them, adding value to their systems, we'll make it obvious to the others that this is the right way to progress. And also for businesses who aren't as ready to release data publicly, our platform uncovers which ESG metrics need to be reported, meaning that closed enterprises become gradually aware of what is absolutely necessary to disclose in a minimum. And this is actually all of a conversation about standardization, because standards are what make people care. Without standards, there is no agreement and there's no action. So we're kind of sitting at this top layer here with ESG and CSR standards. And this question of what does ethical mean, what makes a product ethical, is highly subjective and nuanced. And so the way we aim to solve this is by empowering anyone to create their own certification. We enable individuals and groups to crowdsource new kinds of certifications and direct transparency efforts by deciding as a collective what's most important. And this is important because people trust each other much more than they trust companies or even NGOs. So peer-to-peer certifications is what we're aiming for here. And when we go to the next layer down and look at disclosure standards, which are what the supply chain transparency providers are interested in, the question here is really, what should we publish to prove that we're ethical? And so there's this indirect relationship between the question of what ethical means itself and the data needed to prove that. And so our platform will help to inform this and enable these platforms to release information that's much more useful and answers more of these questions than they would be without us. And then so I guess in summary, the question that we're kind of providing answers for here is, how do we make sure we're aiming at the right targets and we get there the fastest when it comes to supply chain transparency, ethical production, all these concerns in the world at the moment?
The first step in the solution is to create a mechanism for groups to move opaque analog certifications into a transparent digital format.
And so how do we do that? Well, here's a bit of a UI mock-up of where we might start. Because a certification, in this case carbon emissions, is really just a calculation based upon some science. And so it's got a name, it's got some assumptions that you'd be making, and then the calculation itself. Plus, of course, some metadata to aid in discovery and comparison with alternative calculations in order to be able to discover alternatives. And so these calculations are composed of further calculations. And such calculations can be explored and tested against real production data with visibility that occurs all the way down to the raw supply chain data itself. And we acknowledge that there's a lot of information here. And I suppose this is the very first iteration of our interface. There'll be many more. But it doesn't actually have to be for everyone, although that is our ultimate goal. Really, just NGOs, independent certification authorities, and activists are the only market we really need to do this. Others will probably just pick presets based on things that they've been recommended by those that they trust. And also to note that the carbon example we're using here is really just for our benefit. When pitching to an NGO, we'd focus on a particular certification that is contentious and provable based on their domain of expertise. And we'll talk through this a little more in the roadmap. And we can come back to this slide later. I know there's a lot going on here. So essentially where we end up with this is this place where our MVP begins the work of leading us towards certifiable CSR standards such as ISO 26000. And it's really about this process of discovery. What are users trying to certify? Is the science correct? What assumptions are they making? And what gaps in the supply chain data are having to be estimated? And so we end up with the situation where we can tell if you track these data points in your supply chain, you can automatically earn these certifications. And the certifications aren't just limited to ESG and CSR. They could also be product certifications such as organic and free range, like we've mentioned, carbon neutral, fertilizer free. They could be NGO endorsements. They could be based on common interest groups, such as the way that BICOT operates, community endorsements, or even religious certifications, such as halal. So once we've built this sort of core platform, the next step is adding additional engagement features. And the whole drive here is to make the data better, whether it's the science in terms of the certifications that people are creating with our platform, or the raw supply chain transparency data itself. And I just want to note before we dive in that all these features are quite loosely linked, and it's not necessary to add them all at once. The order could change based on UX validation as to which ones people care about, and they can be iterated quite easily. So thinking about our platform, for every data point, and by a data point, we're talking about the assumptions themselves, the calculations, and the raw production data. All of these things are sort of entities in their own right. And so for each of these, we'll have trust scores, which are the primary value indicator in our platform. And this is a bit of a first pass at the UX of how we might start to both indicate and represent trust. And in this case, we're trying to sort of show the distribution of how many people trust things at a different level. So this one here, for example, would indicate that there's a contentious point of trust here where lots of people don't trust it at all, but an equally significant number of people find it quite trustworthy. So the point with these trust scores is that we need an indicator of the data's worth that is insulated from other incentives and interests. And there can't be any financial barrier to entry either. It has to be completely democratic in terms of who has input here. And of course, prevention of civil attacks is also important. And we'll be continuing asking the community for feedback on how to combat these things and communicating our solutions. But it's just sort of worth pointing out to stress that having data on the blockchain doesn't necessarily mean it's trustworthy. Having verification of the data doesn't even necessarily mean it's trustworthy, nor does expert opinion or investment or staking. All these things definitely help to make things more trustworthy, but they really depend on the people that are causing these actions. If they're not trustworthy, how can the things they say be? And so we're moving to this idea that the real value that we're generating with this platform is the idea of certifications as tokens. So you can think of these certifications as sort of non-fungible tokens backed by science, and the value of them is the trust score that people have sort of put into them. Beyond the trust scores, discussion threads are kind of a no-brainer. Users are going to need to be able to discuss and debate both the analysis and the raw data itself. And we'll expect discussion between consumers, NGOs, investors, enterprises, and provenance platforms as they all start to grapple with, what really does ethical mean here. Next, we're going to add bounties because having some financial incentives for improving the data can be very powerful. We can use it to fund research. We can potentially enable a gig economy for impact assessors. And it can also be an alternative revenue stream for NGOs, which would help to realign the incentives of fundraising departments and certification departments, which are a bit out of whack at the moment, as we saw earlier. And there's a growing awareness from NGOs that in conversations with WWF, we've sort of explored that NGOs will be less about fundraising and more about creating trusted brands. And so this is part of that piece. And the other nice thing about bounties that's a real benefit for industry is that ethical producers really want to be able to apply pressure to their upstream suppliers in order to release data about their production downstream. And so this gives them a way to do that. And so sort of related to the bounties, then we have verification systems. And fieldwork validation is something that we can give provenance platforms for free here. So validating the fieldwork with observations, photo evidence, and IoT would basically be done on an open protocol such as ICSO or ALICE, which means that other platforms dealing with supply chain transparency like Viant can draw in this data for free. And ICSO are extremely excited to work with us on this, so that's exciting. And just to note, yeah, this is another indirect influencer for trust scores, but it's kind of not the whole picture. You can't just say that something's verified, therefore it's trustworthy.
So now that you've seen what we want to build, we're going to talk about ourselves a little bit. So I'm currently doing an MBA, very part-time, at Swinburne University of Technology with a focus on environmental social governance and social entrepreneurship and innovation. I was recently a Blue Chili finalist, which is a well-known Australian startup accelerator, for a crypto wallet, but I decided not to take funding because I wanted to build something more purpose-driven. I have 7 years experience in growth marketing for startups here in Australia and in San Francisco and Las Vegas. I founded Girls in Tech Las Vegas and was a speaker at South by Southwest. I founded and managed a wellness centre for 18 months in Sydney. I built a community and movement around that centre, driven by events, digital marketing, and content creation. I secured press placements on ABC TV and in Marie Claire and Women's Health magazines through my own press outreach. These days, I'm the Director of Women in Blockchain in Melbourne, Blockchain for Social Impact Melbourne, and very involved with the local Web3 community.
And as for myself, I'm a full stack developer with a bit over 15 years of experience in the web and games industries. I've done supply chain protocol work with Viant and also IBM Hyperledger Composer, and I built provenance apps for the diamond and luxury goods industries at Everledger, which now form the foundation of their platform. I've built weather data ingestion and query systems, dealing with petabyte scale data sets. I'm able to hire a team of outstanding devs with the right skills, and I was previously a co-founder of a charity and advertising social enterprise startup. So I know how to build partnerships with NGOs and charities and how these sorts of industries work internally. I also have a family history in sustainability and NGO work, so it's kind of in my blood. And I've already embedded within the wider ecosystem of commons and open source initiatives that ConsenSys aims to support, such as the Ethereum Commons Co-op and the Open App ecosystem, which was started by the Inspiral Foundation long before blockchain ever came onto the horizon. I'm also an idealist, and I'm very good at inspiring others to work toward a shared vision.
And above all else, this is our purpose and our passion. We have a range of excellent advisors and supporters on board, both internally and externally. Australian ConsenSys devs, Lucas, Chris, and Barry, have all said that they'd be interested in joining our project at some point. Devs are inspired by our vision because it represents the values that drove them to enter the blockchain and Ethereum space. That is, making the world a better place. We've integrated feedback from ConsenSys designers on research, customer validation, and product design. Even though we're not designers, we know how important testing and usability is. We want to hire a UX researcher / design co-founder to complete our leadership trifecta by covering the 3 pillars of business, tech, and design.
And this is not an exhaustive list of our external advisors, and just some key advisory roles that are worth mentioning. So on the protocol side, we have tight relationships with those who literally wrote the book on open supply chain standards and open economic data, which is how we're structuring the internal parts of our platform. Our tech advisors include those with backgrounds in big data and category theory, which is critical for us, as we'll see later, as well as the visionary creators behind some of our tech choices, so we can get recommendations and information straight from the horse's mouth. In industry, we've just begun accumulating a wide range of expertise from NGOs, sustainability and corporate social responsibility experts, as well as management consultants and investment.
We've had some really encouraging conversations with industry experts. For example, Michael Torrance, Chief Sustainability Officer at the Bank of Montreal, said, "If you get this right, you could effectively replace regulation." We've also had a couple of talks now with representatives from the British Standards Institute, who are key drivers in the development of ISO standards. They want to be what they call a bridging influence from ad hoc standards experimentation on our platform to ratifying global ESG standards over the long term. Ethical producers have also been very enthusiastic about the platform and the opportunities it opens up in terms of demanding greater transparency from their upstream suppliers. The Dragonfly Initiative were an interesting group to talk to, as they're management consultants who are essentially working on the same problems as us on a case-by-case basis. It's worth noting that groups already exist who are trying to consolidate the diverse market of ESG and CSR standards down to a core set of criteria that can be measured, as Sam explained with regards to standardization earlier. They said that what we're doing is important, not only because people don't trust certifications anymore, but also because the platform could help to democratize the cost of attaining ESG certifications. So now I'm going to go over our go-to-market strategy. These images represent the different market sectors that we will engage with on our roadmap. Phase 1 is our certification authoring platform, which is all about creating a really easy-to-use application that empowers anyone to create certifications. We will engage NGOs as the current experts to take the analog certifications they already provide and create digital versions of them. This will make it really clear to producers and transparency providers what supply chain information they need to track in order to become automatically certified. It will also start to make it clear where the assumptions and knowledge gaps lie in existing certifications. Developing partnerships with various transparency providers is key for us because it will make it possible for NGOs to experiment with real data on the platform when they're authoring certifications. We'll need to identify a particular certification with a particular NGO to partner with in order to launch and demonstrate the platform's utility. Initially, based on what's provable with a core production dataset, essentially what's in it and where'd it come from, we've identified some certifications as likely candidates. We could go with organic, naturally grown, non-GMO, free of chemical treatments, free of food dyes, even low carbon or carbon neutral, which will have many estimates and inferences to act as signals to improve the certification research and provenance data. We'll also be exploring partnerships outside of the supply chain transparency space, and success there may lead us in different directions. We've identified some other low-hanging fruit and groups working on these problems both externally and within the mesh, such as free range, responsible agriculture, worker compensation and human rights, deforestation-free and environmentally sustainable, philanthropy and giving. In the notes for this slide, you can see some of the names of groups we might engage in each of these areas. Eventually, we hope to be able to solve complex longitudinal issues like slave-free. In our conversations with slave-free trade, we found that integration of supply chain data, verification systems, worker identity, and whistleblowing will all play a role. And we'll just touch on phases 2 and 3 briefly, as they are a long way down our roadmap. But when sufficient certifications have been authored and supply chain data partnerships have been achieved, we can begin to disrupt the impact investment industry in phase 2 and eventually create product rating apps with real utility for consumers in phase 3. Also note that there are related persona contexts, pain point analyses, and validation work in our appendix. We've been graciously connected with a number of key players in the supply chain impact investment and ESG standards industries. The connections that we've developed so far have been synergistic, not as the result of seeking them out deliberately. We're confident that we'll establish many more connections when we start facing outward to form official partnerships. The suggestion to create this consortium came from Blockchain for Social Impact and the British Standards Institute, who we're in touch with. The British Standards Institute see a need for ethical standards specifically as they relate to supply chain provenance and blockchain. Supply chain is a massive space, so there's a need to narrow in on it specifically rather than address it as part of Blockchain for Social Impact, which is too broad to develop practical and relevant standards in this space. This consortium will also draw in others who aren't necessarily part of social impact, such as transparency platforms. We want to create a shared vision that organizations can rally around. We can build a strong public narrative for change and champion the efforts of others. It will also serve as an effective way of positioning ourselves as a market leader. In terms of our non-technical roadmap, Partnerships are key, and forming them will be an ongoing process once we move beyond the UI demo. Making partnerships early will enable us to get input and iterate better. Open source provenance apps can be integrated first and without requiring partnership work. This will pressure others to follow suit once they realize the value they can add to their platforms. Integrations prove we can ingest, transform, and query the data. Regarding certification experts, as mentioned in the roadmap, we want to hone in on one certification supplied by an NGO or special interest group early so that we can collaborate with them and learn about their needs. We'll involve them in the creation of our UI demos so they can give feedback as part of our UX research and ensure that we build something very practical and useful. Standardization is also something that we want to champion as a consumer of supply chain data. It'll make our lives a whole lot easier. Formalizing our partnership with the British Standards Institute and launching our ethical supply chain consortium probably won't happen until at least the 18-month mark, after which we'll have goals to hit around marketing and traction. It will also be around this time we'll announce our ESG standardization project. Phase 2, engaging investors and starting work on an investment platform, should also happen at about the 18-month mark, but we all know how these far future projections go. In terms of UX and design work, we still need to do a lot of research. In tandem with the UI demo will be a lot of product design work and UX research to inform the information architecture and structure of the app. After we've completed the demo and had the follow-up with labs, we'll be ready to engage the brand design circle and start a visual refresh. We'll also start putting the UI in the hands of more experts and getting continual feedback, as well as beginning to release reusable UI components based on design systems thinking. By Q3, we want to be in a place where the certification authoring UI is intuitive and experts can use it without guidance. A year out, our aim is to soft launch a website and start accumulating expressions of interest for when we launch the certification authoring platform backed by real data. This slide outlines the major risks as we see them. The primary concern is not being able to form partnerships with supply chain transparency providers and certification experts or NGOs, which would limit the utility of the platform. We can mitigate the supply chain layer by building against open systems first, and if necessary, we can fill the certification content gap by hiring an expert internally. Not being able to aggregate enough data to prove particular certifications could also be viewed as a significant risk. But all this really means is that we've come into the market early and that we need to wait for industry and supply chain transparency platforms to catch up. In such a case, we would be sending important signals to these market sectors, urging them to disclose more data.
And from a technical standpoint, as with all big data analytics systems, the main concern here is just query speed, really, which there are various tricks to mitigate, such as pre-computing queries or operating on small subsets of the data. We don't expect this to be a significant problem until some years away. The total number of provenance records available within supply chain transparency systems currently is probably not even on the order of terabytes. So, into the technical details. Our development roadmap is quite complicated to look at, so I'm just going to go over it briefly. The key things I kind of want to highlight are that this is a feature-based roadmap because we want to be continuously releasing useful modules. So all of these boxes are really sort of standalone modules that can have utility elsewhere in the ecosystem. And so deliverability will be ongoing, and we'll be delivering value the whole way along. This first step of creating a system to import data from other supply chain transparency platforms will be reasonably quick, since we can leverage Lethio's modules to do a lot of the heavy lifting here. And when we get right to this side, these future platform deliverables that are outlined, ethical equity investment platform and our online marketplace integrations, as well as consumer apps, are things we'll build next, which are outlined soon. So just to sort of, the first step, I guess, in terms of data import is our ETL system. And for those who don't know the acronym, essentially all it means is that we're going to extract data from all of these sources. We're going to take all these different formats and transform them into a single unified format that covers all bases and that we can query efficiently. And then we're going to load it up into basically a big data warehousing system like Spark. And the key thing here to remember is that we have to maintain this position of being unbiased, transparent, and informed. And so the REA data model, which stands for Resource Event Agent, is this very high-level grammar, which I've talked about in detail in my Open Value Networks talk at the retreat. And we have consultants to help us with this because they're the ones who wrote it, essentially. But the key point is that at the lowest level, right down at the data has to be unbiased, or else you're already kind of imposing your own ethics to begin with. And this schema is the official ISO accounting ontology, and it's been in development since 1979 with the express goal of being unbiased and objective kind of view of any economic interaction, not just supply chain. So that's also key because we need to be applicable to other areas. So when we start dealing with philanthropic promises, exchanges and finance, as well as the natural environment, all that data will be able to be represented in this format and should fit into our system really easily. And so success will be achieved on this whole piece when we've basically ingested data efficiently from multiple sources and REA-based queries are possible on it. And the other key thing here, aside from the fact that Alethio is going to play a part in a lot of the heavy lifting and pulling stuff out of Ethereum, is that this whole system needs to be deterministic in nature so that anyone can install it and run it on their own machines. So basically, we don't want to be, a single centralized source of trust in this. We want anyone to be able to run our data, potentially explore ways we can have other people run our system with us, but at least having the ability for anyone to be able to spin one up and cross-check what we are doing. So once we have the data, the next thing is basically a query engine. And so really what this comes down to from a technical point of view is the idea of certifications as analytics. So if you think about on the right here, this being sort of the raw production data in terms of basically a series of events and all the materials that went into them, the energy that was used, the workers who were involved, all the kind of stuff you'd expect. And over on the left being something that an end user might see in a marketplace app where they can see a product as well as all of the certifications and ethics that they've chosen to measure things by. And the piece in the middle is this analytics piece. So really what our certifications are is the science, and that science is represented in terms of this basically search query. And so when you think about it, the assumptions that we looked at before in our mock-ups are really just variables. The calculations that we're doing are really just pure functions, and those pure functions can sort of be decomposed until you get down to these raw sort of built-in functions, which sit very well as MapReduce queries in a big data warehouse. So what this is really about is the creation of an abstract formal grammar which maps onto the query engine of the chosen database system. And there's actually a precedent for this in the REA space. So they have this concept that they call value equations, which they use already over their kind of economic networks in order to determine how much energy and effort was put into different parts of a production process and automatically distribute income in response. So this is, of course, a complicated thing. And what we're building here, when you think about it from a technical point of view, is really just a limited form of query builder. And that's why it's a big UX job. That's why we're going to have to think about this a lot, have a lot of design input and a lot of iterations, because query builders don't exactly have a good reputation for usability. And once we've succeeded here, what we'll have is a foundational element that supports user-created certifications, ESG metrics, product recommendations, and improvement signals to both users and producers, as well as this wider social discourse around ethics that we're hoping to create. So zooming out a little bit, once we've got the core feature in place, our wider system architecture, we don't have a Y blockchain slide in our deck. And the reason for that is that this isn't really a blockchain app. In fact, it's more of a big data app and a traditional, sort of query engine than anything else. And that's because this is all about using blockchain where it's appropriate. And in the case of us, it's appropriate for the provenance data that people are already building. It's appropriate for verifications, and it's appropriate for bounties because they're financial, of course. And this central piece here, this database that we query against, is really everything that blockchain can't be. It's indexable, searchable, high-speed, centralized database. And if you think about kind of the ultimate goal of blockchain, really, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need this at all. We'd be able to query this stuff straight from the blockchain, but we're not there yet, and it's a way off. Also, just wanted to note that each piece here is very independent of others again, and so development effort is less than it seems, really. we can implement these things iteratively in an agile manner. I'll leave discussion of our write-heavy off-chain network architecture for now in terms of how we store the certifications, the conversation data around the discussion of the ethics, and the trust ratings themselves. But in short, we've chosen Holochain as being perfectly suited for this purpose, as it's very easy to develop on and simple to incentivize participation in. So we'll be able to kind of decentralize these things a lot more easily than a lot of traditional setups have managed to. And we've also considered OrbitDB as a backend if Holochain seems to be inappropriate, which is really just a database that sits on top of IPFS. And we have considered state channels, but they're actually quite complex to build, although it's getting easier. And we really don't need any of these things committed to chain. So there's no need to have the additional complexity and cost of a state channel settle into chain every so often.
So I'm going to outline some future projects we're considering, as well as talk through how we plan to create revenue. Like many other spokes, we're building protocols first, platforms second. Our MVP is about defining the protocol for ethics and creating sufficient certification and provenance data for market utility. Once we have this, we can create an equity investment platform. Minimal participation is needed for this, as only enterprises with ethical drive need to be part of it. Originally, we were only thinking about consumer-facing platforms, but after some research and validation, we uncovered that servicing the investor market is an easier way to make greater impact initially. An ethical and equity investment platform would be based on the same data, aggregated differently, in a company-centric rather than product-centric way. Because we're providing a layer of hard evidence, we also end up with provable ESG compliance. And we can also enable real-time ESG metrics with continuous evaluation, whereas in their current state, certifications are based on annual, even biannual evaluation. Enterprises are alerted ahead of time when an auditor is going to visit a factory, for example. Both of these factors create lots of room to hide. The Impact Investment Australia Survey 2016 found that investors are really looking for measurability of impact in order to make evidence-based investments. We've had some informative conversations with people in the impact investment industry, and we'd like to highlight a few of them. We spoke to Monica Bradley, founder and director of Purposeful Capital, and also the non-executive director of B Corp in Australia. And she said, we aren't going to have good impact investing until it's as easy to get impact data as it is to get financials. Your platform would give us much more sophisticated market signals to define what value is. And we need a lot more data points on which to make decisions regarding what will have value in a forward-looking market. We also spoke to Jen Ziegner, the Business Development Manager at Impact Investment Australia, who said that there's a huge gap in proper impact assessment and measurement. We very much need standardized impact metrics. Lots of firms are trying to take on this responsibility of standardizing impact metrics in order to try to position themselves as a key player in this space, which leads to a very dispersed market. Aggregation is one of the biggest challenges. Looking forward, there'll be a value tipping point when enough quality peer-reviewed certifications and supply chain transparency data exist to provide real utility in a consumer marketplace. We can roll our certifications out to online markets via API integrations and also create a product scanner app for use in the supermarket. This is intertwined with a tipping point of consumers demanding blockchain transparency, so education is an important part of this aspect of our platform. Essentially, the goal is to empower consumers to see the subjective true cost of the products they purchase. By subjective true cost, we mean that different certifications get matched to different users based on each individual's selection criteria. For any given certification, they're free to dive into the data and science that backs it up, question and even edit a certification as much as they feel is necessary.
We also have some random revenue stream ideas that we're considering. And so kind of one of the simpler ones is just taking fees on bounties. And we sort of preset those, but we want them to be configurable and to enable users to opt out, because imposing a service fee we see as kind of a awkward thing for a platform focused on ethics. We also would be looking to use Gitcoin to fund development and encourage open source participation. And we're looking at cooperative equity models to give contributors even more stake in the success of the platform. In terms of sort of financial self-sufficiency of our MVP, we're considering a donationware model to keep it self-sustaining, and we've outlined that a little more in the appendix. And we're also thinking about funding from NGOs and ethically motivated organizations. And similar to the Bounties, we also sort of have this idea that we might allow users to commit to certifications by permanently enshrining them on the blockchain and charge fees on those transactions as well. So beyond revenue, let's have a think about some of the other returns because they're the real reasons that we should do this. So Stephen Alexander, who's a MESH member, a digital value capture expert who used to advise Bill Gates, introduced us to this concept of sacred value, basically things that people innately care deeply about. And they'll go way beyond personal gain, ambition, or even activism to attain this kind of value, which means that they'll pay for it. And that's what the bounties are there for. And they'll pay for it because they're the ones who will suffer the consequences and recognize it. And by suffering the consequences, essentially, when we think about human rights, we're talking about nothing less than acquiring the human right to clean food, water, air, and soil, which we in no way have at the moment. And you only have to look at the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, the fact that Nestle is buying up all the water in America, the consequences of industrial agriculture or air pollution in China to know that this is true. We also want to enable people to comprehend ethics and see the true cost of things, and for the first time, provide tangible signals to industry as to what consumers really consider important. And so there's always been in consumer society this disconnect between where people spend their money and the world they want to live in. And so we want to create that connection that leads us toward a truly ethical and sustainable global economy, as we discussed right at the beginning. And Stephen, as he said here, you're onto something here of massive magnitude. And in our interview with him, which I'd encourage you to read on Quip, as it's quite fascinating, he indicates the ripple-on effects of a platform like this could lead to billions, if not trillions, in untapped value. There's also a lot of mutual benefit for spokes here and ways we can assist the mesh. So when it comes to Viant, we want to consult on the development of open source version and protocol work, which we've already begun with them. And we want to drive usage and funnel sales to them just by their presence in the platform and the fact that people will be educated and discovering them as they dig into what we're doing. In terms of Alethio, we want to contribute back core data transform and ETL system components. So essentially provide all the tools that people might need to be able to draw provenance information out of the blockchain. And with Leapit, it's a bit further afield, but we can definitely help them by consuming and iterating on their marketplace discovery and exchange protocols, and potentially join forces with their future efforts to create ethically aware marketplaces. And then when it comes to the others like Gitcoin and Uport, we're dogfooding them, and that's going to certainly help in terms of their usability and getting bugs sorted out. And it's also worth noting that Uport's an important part of the blockchain upsell and learning experience. So we're intentionally only going to include Uport and Facebook logins on this platform because everyone hates Facebook, and this will push them toward the self-sovereign path as they're educated about blockchain. Other non-financial returns, we've sort of covered most of these already. I'll just kind of read through them very quickly. So open source code modules and contribution to Commons projects will be ongoing. This includes the Ethereum Commons Co-op started recently, as well as the Open App ecosystem, which the Inspiral Foundation started quite some time ago. There'll be work on standardization, convergence, and protocol work. And as one of the first consumers of supply chain data, we're uniquely positioned to sort of dog food these platforms. We'll be providing market intelligence for all provenance platforms, not just Viant, as well as NGOs who are wondering what people really care about. We'll be evangelizing, educating, and communicating the benefits of blockchain at every opportunity, as we discussed with Uport. And there'll be reputational benefits to ConsenSys as a positive actor in the ecosystem and a contributor to the commons, as well as naturally increased Ethereum network utilization. The ask.
So here's our financial ask. This is for our year-long roadmap, but initially we're just focusing on building the UI demo of the Certification Authoring Tool, or MVP, within the first 3 months before we have a checkpoint with labs. Aside from the design co-founder hire, there won't be much in the way of spend until after this point. Again, this rack presentation is mostly about us becoming a legitimate ConsenSys spoke so that we can move forward effectively. Also, just so that you're aware, we will uphold that our team members can work on other projects 20% of the time. We expect a need for APAC community work and to assist with solutions. Design hires would be very useful in APAC as we are very low on that skill set in this region. As you can see, we haven't mentioned a marketing budget. That's because we don't need much right now. Any necessary costs can come from discretionary budget. Regarding conference and travel costs, please note that travel overseas is expensive for us given that we're in Australia, and we want to be able to send representatives to sustainability, ethics, and supply chain conferences because partnerships are such a key driver for us. Thank you very much.
Cool.